Ben was knocked to the ground again. He watched a large figure in purple sweatpants and a white t-shirt disappear into the crowd. He looked down at his empty hands and felt stupid for taking out his money and counting it on the street. He'd read books about New York and seen it on TV and in movies. He knew how dangerous the city was supposed to be. He stood up again and pulled the bookmark from his pocket. He read his father's address, looked up the street, and squinted. He saw 43rd Street, so he walked in the direction of the higher numbers, along 8th Avenue. He was glad the streets were in numerical order. It would be easy to follow them up to 74th Street. He was halfway there when a taxi appeared from nowhere and brushed Ben's leg. A hand grabbed his shirt and yanked him back onto the sidewalk to safety. It belonged to a woman with a blue kerchief tied around pink curlers in her hair. She shook a finger in Ben's face. Rattled, Ben kept walking. Soon he arrived at a gigantic traffic circle. Trying to look in every direction at once made Ben dizzy. Which way was he supposed to go? He held the bookmark out to a woman walking a fat brown dog and pointed to his father's address. The woman paused just long enough to read it. She moved her mouth and gestured toward the road that bordered a huge park. Ben dodged the cars as he ran through the traffic circle. Soon he was walking beneath the swaying green trees that hung over a wall separating the park from the sidewalk. There were fewer people here than near the bus station, but it was still crowded compared to Gunflint Lake. At last, he arrived at 74th Street. There was only one way to turn, so he made a left and walked past rows and rows of brown and tan buildings, all with stairs leading up to doors on the second floor. A dirty white cat scuttled across the sidewalk into a pile of garbage bags. Ben checked the address on the bookmark again. He looked up and realized he was standing in front of his father's building. Ben's heart beat wildly as he climbed the steps and studied the brass panel of doorbells. Next to each button was a little piece of paper with a name on it. Most of the paper had disintegrated, though, so the names were unreadable. Ben put down his suitcase, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and looked once more at the bookmark before returning it to his pocket. He pressed the button for 3B. He kept pressing it with one finger, unsure if it was connecting, while his other hand rubbed the smooth silver locket around his neck. After a few minutes, a small woman in a thin blue nightgown opened the door. She had gray hair and brown skin, shiny with perspiration, and she didn't look happy. She was already talking when the door opened. Ben just stared at her. "I'm looking for Daniel," he interrupted, still finding it strange to use his voice when he couldn't hear himself. "He's my father." Ben opened the locket and showed the woman the photograph. The woman stared at the photo, then at Ben. A look of displeasure crossed her face. She kept talking, using her hands sometimes to punctuate a point. Ben could not figure out what she was trying to tell him. Back home, even when his family and the hospital staff had written things down for him, they still talked a lot, and Ben realized that he had to do a huge amount of guesswork to piece together a conversation. He closed the locket, put it inside his shirt, and tried a different question. "Does Daniel live in 3B? The answer this time was clear. No. Ben felt faint. Why had it never occurred to him that his dad might not live here anymore? Feeling desperate, he said, "Do you know where he lives now?" The woman seemed to laugh and then said something else, and Ben could tell she'd never heard of Daniel. He kept staring at her mouth. He thought he recognized the word mother on her lips. Was she asking where his mother was? Ben pointed to a big white car parked nearby. A woman was sitting behind the wheel. "That's my mom," he said. The woman at the door sneered and said something Ben was sure wasn't nice. Then she shut the door in his face. Tears stung his eyes, and the street seemed to turn upside down. How stupid he was for thinking it would be that simple. He sank down onto the top step and buried his head in his hands. After a few minutes, Ben opened the locket and stared into his dad's dark eyes. "Where are you?" he asked. "What do I do now?" He didn't even know his dad's last name. At a loss for where to go, Ben pulled the bookmark from his pocket again. His dad's handwriting was fading where it ran through the creases. He turned it over and looked at the drawing of Kincaid's and the black cat and all those books. He had no other clues, so he decided to walk to the bookstore. If his dad had once lived in this neighborhood, maybe the people at Kincaid's would remember him. It was a long shot, but he didn't know where else to turn. Ben continued uptown. After a few blocks, he stopped at a red stone building set back a little bit from the road. It was surrounded by trees and seemed larger than any of the other buildings nearby. The name of the building fluttered on a banner hung between two columns. It looked like a castle from a fairy tale. Ben studied the museum in awe. The steps, the giant green statue of a man on horseback, the columns and windows. It was magnificent. If only his mom were here with him, walking beside him, her arm on his shoulder. Did she know his dad had moved, or would she have been surprised as well? Even if they hadn't been able to find Ben's dad, he and his mom could have gone into the museum together. Ben prayed that someone in the bookstore would remember his father. By the time he arrived at the address on the bookmark, his t-shirt was completely soaked through with sweat. Cigarette butts and bits of newspaper gathered in dirty piles on the ground in front of the store. He looked up at the storefront window. There was no black cat or boxes of books. There was no bookstore at all, just a padlock running through a metal grate that was pulled down over a broken glass window. Plywood sheets were nailed up in pieces behind the grate. Remnants of a sign that read Kin Book hung at an angle from a single nail. Ben pressed his eye against a hole in the plywood and felt his stomach turn. Except for a few rows of fallen shelves, some pipes leaning at odd angles, and a couple of overturned cardboard boxes, the store was empty. Now what would he do? As he stared in disbelief, a boy about his age appeared from nowhere, startling him. The boy had long, curly black hair and wore a striped t-shirt. He had a Polaroid camera around his neck and a knapsack on his back. He was moving his lips and pointing down the block. What did he want? A man standing nearby waved impatiently to the boy. Ben's head roared. He gathered up his things and ran. The heat was unbearable, and his skin burned in the sun. But he kept going until he was back at the museum. He bounded up the stone steps past the statue. At the top he tripped, and the clasps on his suitcase finally gave way. Everything he owned tumbled out onto the stairs. Ben bit down on his lip to keep from crying again. As he bent over to pick up his things, a shadow fell across him. He glanced upward and saw the curly-haired boy in the striped t-shirt looking down at him, his mouth moving. The boy handed Ben Wonderstruck, which he must have picked up off the stairs. Ben took the book, placed it in the suitcase, and snapped it shut. Then he rushed past the boy and pushed through the revolving doors. The air inside the museum was cool. Light filtered in from high above. It reminded Ben of the church down the road from his mom's library. The walls were covered with warmly colored murals teeming with people and animals and plants. There were long quotations from Theodore Roosevelt painted on the wall as well. It is hard to fail, but it is worse never to have tried to succeed. Ben wasn't sure he agreed, but he thought his mom would have liked that. She would have put it on the refrigerator. Ben had no money for admission, so he waited for someone to ask the guard a question. Then he snuck swiftly under the ropes. He found a bathroom and took a long drink from the faucet. He washed his arms and face. The cold water felt good against his skin. He looked at himself in the mirror, and for a second it was like staring at a stranger. With the water and dirt dripping down his exhausted face, he really did look like an alien. As he dried himself off, he noticed a discarded map of the museum next to the sink. He unfolded it and read the names of the halls. Meteorites, gems and minerals, man in Africa, Northwest Coast Indians, biology of birds, small mammals, Earth history. Like his mom's library, the entire universe was here, organized and waiting. Outside the bathroom was a small cafe. On one of the tables, someone had left a tray with the remains of a sandwich and half a carton of milk. Ben made sure no one was looking, then he inhaled the sandwich and drank the milk. He hadn't realized how hungry he'd been. He followed signs to the elevator and rode to the top floor. With the map in his hands, he easily found the dinosaur skeletons, which rose above him like ancient roller coasters. He wandered beneath flocks of birds hanging from the ceiling, past Komodo dragons with forked tongues sticking out at him, and 2 giant unmoving tortoises protecting their eggs. "Look, Mom, turtles," he said to himself. Continuing onward like a boy lost in a castle, Ben walked through gigantic hallways and down marble staircases. He discovered a herd of elephants standing on a raised platform as if they were posing for a photograph. In the Hall of Ocean Life, a whale hovered in mid-air like a blue zeppelin. Sharks mounted to the walls looked ready to eat him, their deadly white mouths wide open. All through the museum, Ben marveled at the life-size dioramas cut like windows into the dark walls. The dioramas looked out into endless vistas, blazing sunsets, snow-capped mountains, and high fields of grass. Each one was filled with animals that seemed to be frozen in time. They turned their heads, or sat waiting on rocks, or walked toward a stream and then paused mid-breath forever. Ben soon stepped into a dark round space that seemed as if it had been built around the main object in the middle of the room. There, beneath the glow of a spotlight, was a gigantic black meteorite about the size of a car. Ben ran his hand along the shiny, undulating surface. It was smooth to the touch. He read the nearby sign and thought about the meteorite his mom had described to him, the one that had created Gunflint Lake 2 billion years ago. Had it been bigger than this one? And if a meteorite was the same as a shooting star, could you still make a wish even after it had fallen to Earth? Ben pressed his hands against the meteorite. He loved how solid it was. He placed his suitcase on the ground, rested his cheek on the smooth surface, and closed his eyes. He made another wish. When Ben opened his eyes and looked up, he noticed a mirror on the ceiling reflecting coin on top of Agnihito. Amid the silver change, he saw a small piece of folded paper. Before he could reach for it, he was jerked backward, away from the meteorite. He turned and found himself facing an angry guard who was gripping his shoulders and obviously yelling at him. Just as Ben was about to apologize, someone darted past behind the guard, and Ben tried to shake himself free, but couldn't. He tried to read the guard's lips. He thought he was asking where Ben's parents were. My parents told me to meet them in the Hall of Ocean Life in 10 minutes. The guard shook his head, said something else, and then looked toward the Hall of Gems and Minerals, where there seemed to be a problem. He said one last thing to Ben before walking away. Carefully, Ben balanced on top of his suitcase, reached up, and grabbed the note. He unfolded it. In green ink it read, "What's inside the box?" How long had that note been sitting up there? Ben wondered. He reread it and then thought about the museum box in his suitcase. Had he put it back when everything spilled out on the steps? He couldn't remember. He opened his suitcase and dug through his clothes. The box wasn't there. Turning the note over, Ben discovered a little hand-drawn plan of the museum's first floor, also in green ink. Running through the whole thing was a long dotted line that twisted through hallways and ended, like a treasure map with an X. Ben followed it room by room until he came to a narrow corridor lined with dioramas he hadn't passed before. The X on the map was in front of the fifth one. Looking at the diorama, Ben felt a hair on the back of his neck stand up. His suitcase dropped from his hand. He was staring into the shimmering lights of the aurora borealis, cascading across a painted night sky. Beneath the blue light of an unseen moon, 2 wolves were running across a snowy landscape, heading right for Ben. A terrible shiver rippled through him. It was as if someone had cut out the dream from his brain and put it behind glass. Ben read the name of the diorama written in raised gold letters. Wolf, Canis lupus, Gunflint Lake, Minnesota.